The house stood quietly behind a wall of swaying palms, the kind of lush greenery that seemed to whisper secrets in the Florida breeze. From the street, it looked like a peaceful relic of the late 70s, low, sprawling, with white stucco walls and broad windows reflecting the sunlight. But for those who knew its history, the property carried a different kind of weight. It had once belonged to Andy Gibb, the youngest of the Bee Gees' famous trio of brothers. A voice full of yearning and charm had once filled these rooms, but so had turmoil, loneliness, and the shadow of a life cut far too short. After his death in 1988, the house changed hands quietly, its stories whispered more than spoken, as though the walls preferred to keep them locked away. The new owners, Mark and Elaine Hollister, were a married couple in their early 40s who had left Chicago for something warmer, quieter, and more forgiving. They had no personal connection to Andy Gibb, other than Elaine's vague memory of hearing his songs on the radio in her mother's kitchen. To them, the house was a lucky find, a rare property within their budget, with a sunroom overlooking the water and a wide back deck perfect for the evening wine they promised themselves they'd enjoy together more often. The real estate agent had mentioned the name Andy Gibb in passing, her voice light, almost rehearsed, as if she knew it was a detail best treated as trivia. They moved in during the late spring. The first weeks were filled with the normal chaos of unpacking cardboard boxes stacked in odd places, mismatched chairs pulled into the kitchen, and the subtle disorientation of new light falling into unfamiliar corners. At first, the strangeness was nothing more than the adjustment to a different climate, a different rhythm. But slowly, small things began to happen that neither of them could explain. It began in the music room, or what the agent had called the bonus room, but what clearly had once been designed for something more. The room had perfect acoustics, with recessed lighting and a built-in cabinet that seemed purpose-made for vinyl records. On their second night in the house, Elaine was passing by the closed door when she thought she heard a faint, humming melody, soft and smooth, just a few notes, fading when she stopped to listen harder. Mark laughed it off when she told him, suggesting maybe it was the neighbors or the wind, but she had heard it from inside, not through the walls. Within a week, the air in that room began to hold a smell faint, almost sweet, like the lingering scent of cologne that had soaked into wood over decades. Mark noticed it too, though he didn't mention it until one evening when they were both sitting in the room going over bills. He caught the scent mid-sentence, paused, and frowned. "It's like someone was here a minute ago," he said. Late one night, as the Florida rain tapped steadily against the windows, Elaine woke to the sound of music, soft, warm, from somewhere deep in the house. She thought she must be dreaming, but when she stepped into the hallway, the sound grew clearer. It was a love song, gentle and slow, as if played from an old record player. The music led her toward the bonus room. The door was half closed, and when she pushed it open, the sound stopped abruptly. The room was dark except for a pale glow from the streetlight outside, and the air smelled stronger than before, richer, as though someone had just walked past her. She stood there for a long time, listening to the silence. Mark's experiences came a little later. One afternoon, working from home, he swore he heard footsteps moving across the wooden floor in the hallway behind him. He had been on a video call, and the sound had been so distinct that he turned, expecting to see Elaine. But the hallway was empty. Later that evening, when he mentioned it, Elaine only gave him a long, knowing look, the same one he had given her when she'd first described the music. The incidents grew stranger. A glass they'd left on the counter in the kitchen one night was found in the sink the next morning. A framed photograph on the hallway wall was found tilted, though neither of them had touched it. And once, in the dead stillness just before dawn, Elaine awoke to the feeling of someone sitting gently at the edge of the bed. She froze, unable to move, her breath caught in her throat. The presence stayed for several long seconds before the mattress lifted again, as if the unseen figure had stood and walked quietly away. It was Mark who found the photograph. He had been cleaning out one of the cabinets in the bonus room when he discovered a thin envelope tucked at the very back. Inside was a single Polaroid. Andy Gibb smiling at the camera in what looked like that very room, sunlight streaming over his shoulder. In the picture, the room looked exactly the same walls, Same built-in cabinet, but the space felt alive in a way that was hard to explain, as if the photograph itself carried a warmth the current house did not. When Mark showed it to Elaine, she felt something stir in her chest, a heaviness, a kind of unshakable sadness she couldn't put into words. They never spoke openly about leaving, but after that night, neither of them slept well. The house, beautiful as it was, seemed to grow heavier the longer they stayed, as if each day pulled them deeper into something they couldn't quite see. The music still came and went, the scent lingered in certain rooms, and sometimes, in the reflection of the glass doors at night, they thought they saw a figure, a young man, just out of the corner of their eyes, watching quietly, as though waiting for something. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The changes in the house were not loud, not sudden. They crept in the way humidity does in Florida, quietly, without warning, until you realize the air feels different on your skin. Mark and Elaine began to notice that certain hours felt heavier than others, as if the house itself followed some strange, invisible schedule. Late afternoons, just before sunset, carried a particular unease. The golden light that once made the walls glow now seemed muted, as though it had to fight to enter the rooms. Shadows lengthened more quickly than they should have, and there was a stillness that made the faintest sound, a shifting chair, the creak of a step, impossible to ignore. Elaine had taken to spending more time in the kitchen, finding comfort in the familiar routine of chopping vegetables or wiping the counters, yet she couldn't shake the sense of being observed. It was subtle, never the distinct feeling of eyes on her, but more like a constant awareness of space behind her, as if someone were standing just far enough away to stay unseen. Sometimes, without meaning to, she would turn sharply, expecting to catch Mark in the doorway, only to find the hall empty. Mark, meanwhile, began having dreams that felt less like dreams and more like visitations. In them, he would be sitting in the bonus room at night, the windows open to the sound of the wind in the palms. Music would be playing not just in the background, but as if it filled the air itself. In the dream, a figure always stood with his back turned, shoulders slightly hunched, head lowered as though deep in thought. Mark never saw his face, and yet in the dream he somehow knew it was Andy. Each time, before Mark could speak, the figure would slowly turn toward him and Mark would wake, heart racing, with the faint smell of cologne still clinging to the air. They tried to rationalize the occurrences. Old houses creak, air conditioning units hum, scents linger in wood for decades. But the explanations grew thinner with each incident. One evening, while unpacking the last of their moving boxes in the living room, Elaine pulled out an old portable radio they'd brought from Chicago. It hadn't been plugged in for years. They had packed it away without batteries. As she set it on the coffee table, a burst of static filled the room. She froze, staring at it. Slowly, through the static, came the faintest trace of a voice, smooth, melodic, unmistakably singing. The lyrics were unclear, but the warmth in the voice was undeniable. And then, as quickly as it had started, the sound faded, leaving only the ticking of the wall clock. After that, they stopped telling each other every detail of what they experienced. Not because they wanted to hide it, but because saying it aloud seemed to give it weight, to feed it. Still, the silence between them was heavy with unspoken recognition. At dinner, their conversations drifted, sentences trailing off into pauses, both listening for something neither wanted to hear. One night in early June, a thunderstorm rolled in from the Gulf. Rain lashed the windows, the sky split with flashes of white light, and the power flickered several times before holding steady. Elaine was reading in the bedroom when she noticed the sound of music again, low and muffled, as if coming from under the floor. She set her book aside and followed it, each step pulling her toward the bonus room. The closer she got, the clearer the sound became, this time not just a melody, but full lyrics, sung with an aching tenderness that made her chest tighten. She reached the doorway and stopped. The room was dark, the blinds drawn, but in the far corner, she thought she saw movement, a figure standing in the shadows, still and silent. For a moment, her mind tried to convince her it was Mark, but the shape was wrong, slimmer, younger, dressed in something light that caught the faint glow from the hallway. The music seemed to be coming from him, not from any speaker or device. She felt her throat close, Her voice caught somewhere between wanting to say his name and knowing she shouldn't. And then, just as her eyes tried to focus, a lightning flash lit the room for a heartbeat, and he was gone. The music stopped. The only sound was the rain hammering against the glass. Elaine didn't move for nearly a full minute. Her hands trembled, and she could feel her pulse in her neck. She turned slowly and walked back toward the bedroom without looking behind her, though every part of her body told her something was following at a distance, keeping pace until she closed the door. Mark noticed the change in her the next day. She moved through the house as if avoiding certain spots, and when he suggested they eat breakfast in the sunroom, she shook her head without explanation. He didn't press her because, truthfully, he had begun doing the same thing. There were corners of the house he avoided now, not out of fear exactly, but out of a quiet, instinctive understanding that those places did not belong entirely to them. And the strangest part, what neither of them admitted, was that the house didn't feel hostile. It didn't feel like something trying to drive them away. Instead, it was as though it wanted something from them, something they couldn't yet name. The summer heat settled over the neighborhood like a heavy blanket, making the air inside the house feel thick, almost syrupy, even with the hum of the air conditioning. Days passed in a slow, dreamlike haze, and the strangeness in the Hollisters' lives became less like an intrusion and more like a constant undercurrent, something they stopped questioning. Because questioning it meant admitting just how much it had seeped into them. Elaine began waking earlier than usual, not because she wanted to, but because something in the house seemed to call her out of sleep. At first, she thought it was the faint sound of the blinds shifting in the morning breeze. But soon she realized it wasn't a sound at all. It was more like the weight of a presence in the room, patient and expectant. She would lie there with her eyes closed, her skin prickling, convinced that if she opened them, she would see someone standing at the foot of the bed. Mark's experiences grew quieter, subtler, but more personal. He would be working at the desk in the bonus room, sunlight slanting across the floor, when suddenly the faint smell of that same sweet cologne would drift past him. It was always accompanied by the softest shift of the air, like someone had leaned over his shoulder to look at what he was doing. Once, he caught himself smiling without meaning to, as if an unseen hand had settled lightly on his back. When he realized what he was feeling, the smile faded into something else, something closer to unease, because he knew it wasn't his imagination. The house began to reveal small traces of the past in ways they couldn't explain. One evening, Elaine opened a drawer in the hallway cabinet they had never used, and inside, under a yellowed stack of envelopes, she found a napkin folded neatly in half. In the center was a faint, smudged autograph, Andy's name, written in looping, hurried script. The paper smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and something warm and floral, like the ghost of a long-closed dressing room. She held it for a long time before calling Mark over, and when she showed it to him, he didn't say anything, just nodded, as though he had been expecting something like this all along. Nights became the most difficult. The sounds were no longer confined to the bonus room. Soft footsteps would drift down the hallway, slow and deliberate, pausing outside their bedroom door. Sometimes there was a faint rustle, as if someone had brushed their fingers along the wall while passing. The footsteps always stopped before reaching the door, as though the figure was listening, waiting. One night, just past midnight, Elaine woke to find the room faintly illuminated, not by the moon or the streetlight, but by a soft, golden glow that seemed to come from nowhere. She sat up slowly, her breath catching in her chest. At the far side of the room, in the shadow near the dresser, she could see the outline of a man. The light didn't touch his face, but his posture relaxed, slightly tilted, radiated a calm that was almost intimate. She wanted to speak, to ask who he was, even though she already knew. But before she could form the words, the light dimmed, the figure faded, and the room fell back into its normal darkness. In the days that followed, she told herself she had imagined it. But then Mark began speaking less during the evenings, distracted, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. Finally, one humid afternoon, while they sat on the back deck watching the water shift and ripple under the sun, he admitted that he'd been hearing humming again, only this time. It wasn't coming from another room. It was right behind him, as though someone were leaning in, their voice warm and low, the melody carrying an ache that made the hair on his arms stand up. They both knew, without saying it, that the house wasn't simply haunted, it was inhabited. Not just by memories, not just by echoes, but by something aware. Something that didn't want to leave. And in some strange, quiet way, neither of them did either. By late July, the house had taken on a rhythm that was no longer theirs alone. The days felt strangely compressed, the nights impossibly long, as though time inside those walls had loosened from the outside world. Mark and Elaine lived in a state of quiet surrender, moving through the rooms with a kind of awareness they'd never felt in any other home. Every creak of the floorboards, every faint shift of the air carried meaning now. One heavy, windless evening, the change began. They had just finished dinner and were sitting in the living room. The sliding glass doors opened to the sound of crickets and the faint splash of water from a neighbor's pool. Elaine was flipping idly through an old magazine when she noticed the stereo in the corner, the one they had never used, had turned itself on. The volume was low, almost hesitant, but the song that filled the room was unmistakable. It was Andy's voice, smooth, warm, and filled with that same aching vulnerability she had heard on the radio as a child. She froze, her eyes locked on the stereo's glowing display, while Mark turned slowly toward the sound. Neither of them moved. The song played in its entirety, clear and rich, though the stereo's power cord lay visibly unplugged against the wall. When it ended, the silence that followed was almost painful. Elaine felt her eyes sting, and she realized there were tears on her cheeks. She wasn't sure if they were hers, or if she was feeling someone else's sadness pressing through her. That night, she woke to the sound of someone breathing softly near the bed. Not Mark, he was beside her, his chest rising and falling in steady sleep. The breathing was close, at her side, as though someone had knelt beside her to watch her sleep. She kept her eyes closed, her body still, but her heart pounded in her ears. The presence lingered for several seconds before withdrawing, the air shifting gently as though it had stood and walked away. The following day, Mark finally confessed something he had kept to himself. He had been hearing a voice, not clearly, never more than a few words, but enough to know it was speaking to him. Late at night, in the moments between waking and sleep, he would hear a man's voice close to his ear, as though leaning in from just over his shoulder. Sometimes it said his name, sometimes it was a line from a song, and once he swore it had simply said, "Don't let go." They didn't talk about leaving until the morning the photograph fell. It was the framed Polaroid they had found of Andy in the bonus room. They had placed it on the highest shelf, leaning against the wall. Neither of them had touched it in weeks. That morning, as they passed through the hallway together, the frame slid forward and dropped onto the hardwood floor with a sharp crack. The glass shattered. The picture itself was unharmed. Mark bent to pick it up, but before his fingers touched the photo, a wave of cold rolled up his arm, so sudden and deep it made him gasp. Elaine knelt beside him, and they stared at the photograph in silence. For a long moment, neither moved. Then she took it gently from the floor and set it on the table, away from the broken glass. That was when they decided. 2 weeks later, the Hollisters locked the front door for the last time. They told friends it was the heat, that Florida wasn't for them after all. But in truth, they knew they were leaving something behind that didn't belong to them. Something that had been waiting in that house long before they arrived and would still be waiting after they left. Months later, as they settled into a small apartment in Chicago, Elaine found herself thinking of the house on quiet nights. She would remember the faint scent of cologne, the way the light fell in the bonus room in late afternoon, and the sound of a voice she hadn't heard in decades, singing just for her. And sometimes, when the apartment was dark and the city outside was silent, she would wake to the softest hum of a melody, warm, gentle, and unbearably sad, coming from somewhere in the shadows. Because some things, once they found you, never really let go. Months later, as they settled into a small apartment in Chicago, Elaine found herself thinking of the house on quiet nights. She would remember the faint scent of cologne, the way the light fell in the bonus room in late afternoon, and the sound of a voice she hadn't heard in decades, singing just for her. She never told Mark, but some nights she missed it, the quiet sense that something was there with her, even if it had unnerved her. It was a strange kind of absence, like losing a friend she'd never actually met. Mark tried to push the memories away. He threw himself into work, into errands, into the noise of the city. But sometimes, walking home at night, he would catch the echo of a familiar tune carried on the wind between traffic and footsteps. It would stop him cold in the middle of the sidewalk, that soft, yearning voice curling in his ear just as it had in Florida. And then came the night in November when the apartment went quiet after midnight, the street outside wrapped in snow. Elaine stirred in her sleep, frowning, and Mark half awake heard it too. A melody, slow and careful, as though someone was standing in the dark just beyond the bedroom doorway. He sat up, his breath clouding faintly in the sudden chill, and for a moment, he thought he saw a figure there, slim and still, watching them with an expression he couldn't quite read. By the time he blinked, the doorway was empty, but the song lingered in the air, fading slowly, like a memory slipping out of reach. Because some things, once they found you, never really let go. And sometimes they follow. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.